Welcome back, and thanks for joining. You came to see all the action of the FIDE Candidates Tournament, and round 3 did not disappoint. After a pretty dull round 2, we had 4 decisive games, and guess what? We also have 4 leaders of the tournament. So we're going to jump right into the action, and despite what that thumbnail taught you, Fabiano won but did not play the game of the day. The game of the day was turned in by Katerina Lochno, who told me afterward it's probably the game of her entire candidate's career. She played 2 double exclam knight sacrifices and a queen sacrifice. At one point, she considered resigning because she was lost. This game had everything. Let's jump right into it. Katerina is black against Tan Zhongyi, and here she really wants to take the knight and go after the white king. The problem, of course, is that this knight is guarded by the queen. So what to do? Let's put something in the way. She plays the rare interference sacrifice. There's the first double exclam. Now the knight is forking the king and the rook, so you have to take it. But after you take it, now the queen no longer defends the knight, so queen takes knight and the attack is on. Now white weathers the storm because I'm just going to play a bunch of moves here and get to the point where another knight sacrifice was needed because, unfortunately for her, after this move d5, when the pawn was captured, now the knight jumps in and a tactic is coming up. It is in this resigning because Tan found the tactic. You see the double question mark, rook takes, and then the queen just comes to b8 and she's down a piece. However, the white king's a little bit loose. There is an armada of pawns. Watch how the comeback happens. She plays rook b6, and then eventually she gets to this position, and queen to f7 was actually a massive blunder. Let's go back. Pawn to g5. The whole idea was to swing the rook over to the h6 square, and white's move looks quite reasonable. First of all, white should have just taken this, but white played this move, queen f7, with the very reasonable idea of either picking off the knight or, more likely, taking this pawn on f5, trading queens, and of course you want to trade when you're in a winning position. It's essentially a winning move if you get the queens off the chessboard. But watch this. Black leaves the knight on pre and plays rook to f6, and she told me afterward, Katerina, she was hoping the queen did not take. Now, it's not very often in chess that you hope your opponent gives you a queen, but this is actually the best move. Take the knight, give the queen back, and after rook over, just take, and you're going to get a whole bunch of pieces for your queen. A rook, a knight, and a bishop should be better than a black queen in the long run. So very interesting. White could have recovered from the mistake by giving the queen, even though it looks like that was the trap. But what happened instead? Queen takes d5, and Katerina had set all of this up. She saw her second knight sacrifice when she played this move, rook f6. It's a good thing she didn't resign, because the world would have been deprived of knight to f4. This is not as obvious as it looks. It's a double exclam because the computer sees. But do you see? Well, I didn't see it in the moment. Here's why this move is so brilliant. After e takes f4, you might think, oh, rook h6, the rook and the queen are just going to team up for a mate. Well, yes, but not the mate you're thinking of, because after king to g3, then queen to d3 check, you've got to put something in the way. It looks like white should put the queen in the way, right, to get the queens off the board. It actually doesn't really matter, but queen in the way is what happened, and it's what allows for an amazing move. Katerina leaves the queen en prise. Remember, she's already down 2 pieces, and she plays pawn to g4, and the computer has now given her a double exclam for this move. Upon further reflection, I thought she was only going to get 1 exclam, but literally Stockfish thinks a little bit longer and says, you know what, we need to give her her due. Pawn to g4, leaving the queen en prise. If the queen takes, that would have been an incredibly pretty finish, okay? Of course, Tan doesn't want to get checkmated, so she played rook to h2. But after pawn takes, black was up a queen for 2 minor pieces and went on to win. So Katerina is one of the leaders of the tournament. But she's not the only woman leading, because Bibisara Asabayeva actually won first and briefly was the only woman in the lead. And she actually used kind of a similar combo. Now, sorry, Bibisara, I actually going to fast forward past some of the really exciting early parts of the game because I want to get to this really nice endgame idea that you found. Watch the simplification. Okay, there's a lot of pieces on the board, a lot of things that can happen. But Bibisara notices she's got a lot more pawns on the board. So even if the queens and the rooks leave the board, even the opposite colored bishop endgame is winning for black. So she plays queen to h4. A great lesson in simplification, something I'm a huge fan of in my instructional videos. Now here, there's really only one idea. You got to put the rook in the way. And now watch this, a tactic to simplify. Rook to h1 check, forcing the king to take, but that lines the king up with the bishop, which means the pawn is pinned, and a pinned piece does not protect. Queen takes h3. And then when the king moves over, we're going to get the queens off the board too, because after queen check, the attack is so strong. If you leave the queens on the board, you're probably going to get mated, and this is an opposite colored bishop endgame that black can win. Remember, you often need 2 weaknesses to win. Sometimes in opposite colored bishop endgames, you actually need 3, think I have a video about that coming up on YouTube pretty soon. And in this position, the first weakness is going to be this H pawn. Okay, this H pawn, well, it's not exactly a weakness yet. It's actually the G pawn, but white doesn't want to stay babysitting this G pawn. So white plays this move pawn to G4. And there is no world in which black is going to take en passant. Well, there's the YouTube world where I just did it, but that's not what black wants to do, because by keeping the pawn on the board, that pawn is a weakness that white has to keep an eye on. Now, the king is keeping an eye on the H pawn. The bishop's keeping an eye on the B pawn. So white actually is holding the forward for the moment. We need to create a third weakness. That's exactly what Bibisara does. Okay, so we had pawn to B5, and here we go. Pawn up to H3, we've got to guard that pawn. And now let's create one more weakness. She plays A4, and then she plays this move A5 and then A4. I got a little ahead of myself there. And in this position, there is no stopping this pawn from coming down the board to B4. I believe Juginer actually resigned in this position, but if she'd played bishop C3, for example, you can actually play B4 anyway. The bishop can't take because the pawn runs free. And if the pawn takes, then in fact, we do get our third weakness. Both of these pawns, or maybe you could call it one weakness. It's kind of a educational, or shall I say, a moot point. Okay, pawn up coming up to B2 at some point, and the bishop just can't stop both of those pawns. So both Chinese ladies, even though they're number 1s and number 2 seeds, they went down today, and we got some wins. Now, I do want to say, Alexandra Goryachkina got a remarkably similar endgame to Nakamura's endgame yesterday. Actually, hers was winning, but she wasn't able to convert in the end. She would have been our third leader, tantalizingly close. But you know what we're going to do now? We're going to move on to the open section, because Fabiano won the shortest game of the tournament. It was under 20 moves, and here he was as white, and he plays the move knight to G5. Now, I will say at this moment, Wei Yi was blitzing out moves, and Fabiano thought, I just walked into something. He actually felt a little bit chagrined that he'd walked into preparation so early in the game, but he played the move knight to G5, double attacking the knight, and he said something very interesting here. After knight to B6, it was a bit of a question whether or not he was going to get rid of his super strong light-squared bishop to try to win some pawns, but in his mind, he thought he had to, because it was the only reasonable follow-up to knight to G5. So he goes for the pawns, even though he's walking into opponent's prep. That's a little bit of bravery. And after pawn takes and queen takes, he picks off a second pawn, and now he's got to decide, how is he going to finish his development? Okay, turns out he never actually finished his development. He wins the game without developing most of his army. A couple interesting things happen after pawn up to H6 and the knight moves back. He could have actually grabbed a third pawn here. He's not quite that crazy. Instead, he played queen to B5 check, and when the knight moved, he went rook to G1 with this idea of trapping the bishop. He probably figured, I can't castle kingside. I don't want to castle queenside. I might as well develop the rook this way and give black a little bit of a problem with this bishop. Now, black goes ahead and castles. Bishop to G4, though, might have been the road to equality, because if the bishop takes and the pawn takes, the king's going to feel a little bit exposed. Also, this knight one day is going to hop in with juicy tidbits on, or should I say juicy morsels on D3 and F3. So the best move is actually king F1. But the problem is, if you play king F1, black can just repeat and go for a draw. But Wei Yi was in a fighting mood. He didn't do that. He castled instead. And now we had pawn to G4, trapping the bishop. Now, both players in their analysis afterward admitted that knight F6 was probably a better move than what was played in the game. After knight F6, Fabi had intended queen to A4 to guard the pawn and to set up this move rook to G3, finally trapping the bishop. But then black is actually going to play the move pawn to H5, freeing the bishop. And after takes and takes, well, we still have a pretty interesting game. Let's just put it at that, okay? White is still severely underdeveloped for the 2 pawns. That would have been a fascinating struggle, but instead, Wei Yi went for something different. Wei Yi played this move. Let's go back to this position. Yeah. By the way, another line that the two players analyzed, F5, which would have probably never crossed my mind, but it does free the bishop. The problem is white will play G5 and keep the bishop in his jail. And both players agreed here that F5 is a poor move because of the G5 response and the bishop being stuck. And of course, you've also weakened this diagonal to your king, which is never good. Okay, let's go back. So in the actual game, Wei Yi played this move rook to C5, and the queen went back to B3. Now, Fabi was already setting up his idea. Do you see how the queen is kind of spying the bishop? Fabi said, you know what? I think there could be tactics one day. And actually, that day came right away, because black played the unbelievable blunder knight to E5. And after knight takes and rook takes, now the queen just lines up with the bishop. The funny thing is, you have to choose the correct square for the knight. All in a day's work for Fabi, who's once again in the 2800 club. But you can't play knight here, knight here. You don't want to play knight there, because then your queen is babysitting the knight. If you play knight here, the problem is the queen can just come up to D7. And you can't exactly take the bishop, because then your knight's hanging. And the queen also helps free the bishop, because the bishop's just going to take on the next turn. So that's not going to work. And if you play the very weird knight to B1, Well, now the queen will play queen c8, double attacking this and threatening mate on c1 if you take this bishop. So the natural move, I guess after all the other options are exhausted, is knight to d1, and that caused resignation on the spot for Wei Yi because there is no way to save the bishop. And as Fabiano told me afterward in our interview, there's not even a way to get any counterplay with the bishop by sacrificing it. So all hope is lost. White's going to be up not just a piece, but some pawns, and eventually will consolidate. So that was it, 19 moves, and Fabi had won. Now, for a brief moment, he was actually the sole leader, but then one of the two people that was chasing him, well, actually both the men that were chasing him were playing each other, so he couldn't have two people tie him, but he did get one person to tie him, because in this really crazy position between Prague and Sindarov, both of them were +1 like Fabi going into the round. We had sacrifices. Today was really a day of risk-taking, and most of the players that took risks actually were rewarded, because after this move pawn to b4, Sindarov didn't have to take. He actually could have just retreated the bishop, but in his mind, he told me afterward in our interview, he said he was just going to get rolled by these pawns if he didn't end up going for the sacrifice. So knight takes b4. He didn't even say it was an intuitive or anything. He felt like it was just a forced move. He did not want to get squeezed over 20, 30, 40 more moves. After takes and takes, then the game kept on progressing. In fact, they get to a really weird time pressure position. And I'm going to fast forward really far into the position because we ended up getting here. Apologies for the really long fast forward. Anyway, black is already better when white tried this move queen to b3. Now, apparently, if I just go back for 1 second, after takes, the best move was actually knight to c4. Really, really hard move to find. The idea is to get this rook away from the queen, and even though it looks like your knight's hanging, if you take the knight, well, now you've put the rook and the king on the same diagonal. Bishop to b3 will win some material. That's a hard move to find, though. Remember that the open section has a little bit of a different time control than the women's section. There is no increment before move 40, so if you get low on time, you're not getting any time back, and that's exactly where these players found themselves. They had 7 more moves to make. They had so many moves to make that Sindarov had actually lost track of how many more moves he needed to play. But the moves that he did play were actually the great ones, because after queen to b3, check, the king moved to h8. Then the queen dove in, but in a matter of just like 1 or 2 seconds, Sindarov had already planned his response. This knight is overworked. It's trying to guard the bishop, but it's also guarding the fork on e6. Bishop to e6 forks the king and the queen. So Sindarov said, you don't have to ask me for a 3rd second. Rook takes, double exclam. And of course, as we just said, you can't take because of bishop to e6 winning the queen. So it's not much good news for Prague. He had to move his king, but now the king is lined up with the bishop and the rook. So after rook takes, if you take the rook back, the bishop will simply take with discovered check, and black is up a piece, and Javakir Sindarov went on to win. So there we go. Youth movement, just like last time. Gukesh won the candidates, and this time we have Javakir Sindarov, the youngest player in the field, tied for the lead with Fabiano Caruana, one of the older players in the field. Really exciting day of chess in round 3. The ladies are also off the schneid. They're winning some games, and actually today's games were all really, really wild. I don't think that anybody except for Fabiano can say they won a clean game. But anyway, we're not here for clean chess. We're here for exciting chess, and that's what we got. So we'll see you again for round 4. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow.